Hi, I'm Ben from the Business Change team, and today we will be talking about change strategy. In order to go onto the change strategy presentation, go onto the Business Change website and scroll down to Change Management Strategy. This will download the presentation. All you need to do once it's downloaded is select it from your downloads and it will pop up here. So in this video, I will be explaining what we mean by the term change management, what it comprises of, how you can effectively manage a change and why it's beneficial for your project. Then we can move on to how you can better understand your stakeholder environment, defining targets and how you will achieve them. So a quick introduction before we get into the details. The purpose of this document is to aid your approach in supporting the transition to street manager and should be used as a guide rather than a compulsory to-do list. Feel free to use other techniques if you believe they will be benefit for your organisation. So what is change management? In a nutshell, change management is comprised of three key stages: planning, executing and measuring its success, with the aim of supporting an organisation to transition from point A to point B as smoothly as possible. We will go into more detail per stage later on in the video, but for now, think about what questions you should be asking yourself throughout your change journey. Who needs to be involved in the change process? Who needs to be engaged? When and how? What related processes, systems, and ways of working need to be in place? By asking these questions, you can be sure that you are ready for the change both practically and emotionally, as both are equally as important. Key change management considerations. Change is made up of four key areas: processes, tech, ways of working, and skills and behaviours. For your approach to be successful, you need to make sure you've considered how all four will be affected and what needs to happen to support them. Another important consideration is who your stakeholders actually are. Stakeholders are everyone who will be affected by the transition, and we have outlined a few here to give you an idea. It's important to make sure that you are aware of how people are feeling towards the transition and that their concerns are heard and addressed so that they feel supported and trust that the change will be a positive one. So why is change worth doing? I can hear you all asking yourselves this question, and hopefully this slide will give you the answer for what you're looking for. Now, there are numerous benefits to carrying out these activities, but we have outlined the three we think are the most important. The first is to enable your stakeholders to align on a common objective. By this, we mean you need to ensure people are supportive of the transition, otherwise it will never succeed. Change management lets you do this by helping stakeholders to really get to grips with the changes so that they understand the benefits and why they're being made. The second benefit is that change management allows you to adopt a tailored approach centered around particular stakeholders. This delves into the detail and looks at individual circumstance, as each person's obviously going to be affected slightly differently to another. You want to make sure that you are altering your approach per stakeholder so you can best support them. The final point is about knowing who can help you in delivering the change and who will make it more of a challenge for you. If you can identify people who love the idea and support it, they too can help shift the mindset of those who don't. You're not alone in your organisation, so make the most of the people around you. So this slide looks at the stages we saw earlier, but in more detail. Again, these are the recommended steps and should be used as a guide. Feel free to add or remove any steps you feel would benefit your organisation. You could also use other techniques like the ADKAR model, which is an alternative used as a coaching tool to make sure that people support and believe in a change. But then again, you also might prefer to use Kotter's 8-step change model, which is a similar principle but prioritises different objectives at each stage. I'll let you read through this in your own time, but the key takeaway here is to use these steps as a reference. It's not like a gateway where you can't go to stage 2 without having completed the first. Another thing to note is your stakeholders may be at different points in the journey, and that's okay. You might be at stage 5 with one group of stakeholders and the first stage with another. This is normal, and your focus should be to support each group separately in their transition. Going back to what I mentioned in the key change management consideration slides, These are the 4 areas that we have outlined a few street manager related questions for each to give you a bit of an idea of what sorts of things you should be asking yourself. It's really important to make sure you don't just focus on one, otherwise the transition will fail. For example, if you're looking at processes, you want to be asking yourself questions like, would any of the works management processes change? If you're asking yourself about ways of working, you would ask questions like, would there be a need for any change in behaviours? When you're creating your vision, I think this slide is really useful because it helps you to achieve 6 key objectives. The first thing you're looking at is motivation. So people at all levels can answer the question, what's in it for me if I change? You also want to look at strategic direction. So is everyone aligned around a clear objective and a purpose? You also want to look at how you can measure your change to determine how successful it was. You want to focus on making your change approach as user-centric as possible to make sure that it's tailored to the individual and their circumstances. You also want to focus on training so that people are equipped with what they need to succeed to achieve the desired business results. And you also want to look at engagement, so people at all levels are engaged and empowered to take the active role in driving that change. So our suggested analysis on this slide, we have identified 3 different tools you can use to determine the impact of your stakeholders and how they feel about the transition. We have created training videos on the DFT YouTube channel to run you through how to successfully carry out an impact assessment, readiness assessment, and stakeholder analysis. As I previously mentioned, there are other techniques out there, like culture mapping, for example, which is essentially a tool that is used to visualize the values, norms, and employee behavior to achieve the same thing as the sentiment analysis that we have suggested, which is to determine who the supporters are and who are opposed to the transition. Our recommendation is to use a tool called sentiment analysis. You categorize your stakeholders into 5 groups based on how supportive they are of the change. You've got champions, adopters, observers, opposers, and blockers. If it would be beneficial to visualize where they sit in the organization, then you can plot your stakeholders on an influence support matrix seen here on the left. This will give you more flexibility around where someone sits in the group. For example, if someone is an adopter with a high influence, you can plot them in a different place than an adopter with low influence. This gives you more accurate view of where your stakeholders sit and identify any potential risks that may occur. If you do not know the sentiments of your stakeholders, then you can also use an impact influence matrix. The same principle applies here as the previous matrix. The difference here is instead of identifying their support, you determine how much impact the change has on them. For example, here we've got the Street Manager UI user. So this is someone who's going to be using the websites, whether it's the UI or whether it's API, on a regular basis, and therefore their interest or the impact that the change has on them is going to be high. However, they might not have a high influence on the change. Therefore, you can plot them in this quadrant to understand how the change is going to affect them compared to someone, for example, in management. Once you have completed your stakeholder analysis, it would be useful to identify any opportunities or risks. I touched on this earlier, but the key opportunities here are to make sure the people that really support the transition and are excited about it are empowered to drive that change. Similarly, identify risks such as why are people against the transition and determining what you can be doing to shift their mindset. This will help to drive the success of your change efforts. So we recommend setting objectives for each of your stakeholder categories so that it's really clear what you would like to achieve for each group. For example, for your champions, the aim is to keep them supportive and utilize their support by empowering them to drive that change. Whereas with opposers, the aim here is to determine why they are against the change and monitor their sentiment to ensure they don't drift into the blocker quadrant. We also suggest setting targets for specific stakeholders, particularly those with high influence in the group, as they could help to change the mindset of others around them. This slide outlines different techniques you can use to engage with your stakeholders. The things in this list aren't the only options to choose from, and you do not have to use all of the options below. These are just a few recommendations based on successful changes we have carried out in the past. You could also use techniques like focus groups to really get a feel for what the stakeholders are concerned about and really excited for. It's good to consider 3 things regardless of the techniques you're using. Firstly, you want to try to understand how your stakeholders feel towards that transition. Then you need to make sure that they know what is expected of them and what your ask actually is. Then and only then can they carry out the doing. Going back to the tailored approach point, you can use the template on this slide to define how you're going to change your engagement per category. It's important not to assume that one-size-fits-all approach can work in every situation. This roadmap is a template for you to use and edit accordingly to fit your organisation. You can use it as a planning tool to help organise your approach and ensure you're making progress. It also helps you to identify dependencies along the way. Finally, you'll need to execute your transition activities and measure how successful they were. Feel free to use the rollout plan and RACI documents in the business change playbook here, in this link. An important note here is that when executing your transition support, external stakeholders like the business change team or other organisations can deliver these too. We've also provided a tracker template for you to use to help detail who you have engaged with and document their opinions towards the change. We will be creating a separate video for this, and that will be available soon. Thank you for listening, and look out for the tips and tricks videos on how to carry out comms and training.